All right, Pastor Brett, are you good with me getting started with the bios for today? These are some exciting people.
Let's do it.
All right, let's start. Miss Kim, thank you for joining us. We have Kimberly Chung. She is originally from Singapore, a seasoned world traveler and a self-proclaimed third culture kid. She has lived in 5 countries: the Philippines, England, Singapore, Australia, and the US. I'm so jealous right now. And she first came to Austin in 2003 to major in broadcast journalism at the University of Texas. She would describe her career thus far as God, guns, and the internet. First serving on the national staff team for the Campus Renewal, a national college ministry, for 9 years before becoming the head of marketing for TrackPoint, a high-tech weapons manufacturer, and most recently for Tango Internet, a tech Wi-Fi company, where she currently does a mix of enterprise account management and marketing. Kim is skilled at connecting with individuals from diverse culture, religious, and ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds to build strong multicultural teams, particularly when it comes to recruiting and managing millennials and recent college grads. On the side, she serves on leadership with TGA, and that's the Gospel and at Mosaic. She is the current director of operations for the Austin Asian American Film Festival, and she loves reading, baking, cooking, and she's a great baker, y'all, like really great. Playing the piano and guitar, and spending time with friends and checking out new restaurants and food trucks. If you follow her on Instagram, you know that she comes up with some good places too. Please help me welcome Miss Kim Chung.
Hi, thanks for having me, guys.
All right, and one more person. This man needs no introduction and will cringe at anything I say. So I'm gonna talk really fast before he runs in here and tackles me. So y'all, if you see him coming, just like help me. I'm gonna talk fast. Bradley Smith is from Youngstown, Ohio. He's a graduate of the University of Missouri Columbia. Brad received a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and a master's degree in economics. Bradley is a member of the University of Missouri Football Hall of Fame. At Missouri, he shattered the record books during his 4-year career as he left Missouri, holding 69 different Mizzou, Big 12, and NCAA records that span the game, season, and career categories. He became the first player in NCAA Division 1A history to throw for 8,000 yards and rush for 4,000 yards in a career, and he broke the NCAA record for most career rushing yards by a quarterback. Brad Smith is also a Southeastern Conference or SEC legend. He went on to the NFL where he was a super threat playing quarterback, receiver, and special teams for 9 years. Bradley is now a philanthropist and business and real estate investor. Brad serves as deacon and community group leader at Mosaic. He is a little league football and basketball coach and loves to fish in his spare time. Please help me welcome super dad to Bria, Alex, and Astro Justice, my amazing husband, Bradley Smith.
Bradley.
Wow. What are you talking about?
Hercules.
Getting to watch you cringe during that introduction was the highlight of this class.
All right, Pastor Brett, I'm going to hand it over to you to start our questions.
Awesome. Well, Brad, Kim, thank you so much both for joining us and willing to contribute to our conversation. For everyone in the class today, we're going to be looking at the topic of individuals and institutions, how race and justice and discipleship play themselves out in those contexts. As always, if you'll put your view on speaker view so that whoever's talking to us, we can see their face front and center. And actually, I just saw my man Nick Andrews jumped on here with us. Nick's one of my former students from when I was a youth pastor that I had lunch with last week and told him about this class. And so he wanted to jump in today. So what's up, Nick? Glad you're here with us, man. We're going to jump in, and we're gonna have some conversations with Bradley and Kim around the idea of race and injustice and the role of individuals and institutions, and what is our responsibility as followers of Christ within those two areas of our culture. So Brad, Kim, again, thank you so much for joining us. If y'all wouldn't mind, and I'll start with Kimberly, if you could give us just a little background. I know Raza hit on it briefly, although when I read your bio, I didn't realize you had lived in that many different places. Didn't realize you had the extensive world travel experience you had. So I'm actually even more excited about the questions we're going to be asking you today. from that context. But if you could give us some background, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What was your neighborhood like? What is life like for you growing up around the world and here in the United States of America as you moved here? So give us a little background first, and then we'll go to Brad and let him give us a little background as well.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So I am very international, as you guys can tell. I was born in the Philippines and lived there until I was about 2, and then moved to London, England for about a year. That's the earliest place I remember living. If you guys ever saw Mary Poppins, and there's a scene in Trafalgar Square where they feed the pigeons, that's my earliest memory, going there as a child to feed pigeons. I grew up mostly in Singapore. So from the time I was 3 until I was 17. And then my parents, when I was 16, sat me down and said, hey, we're moving to Australia, so you have 6 months to apply to college, get your stuff together, and go. So that was a crazy 6 months of my life. They decided that my brother would do better in high school there. And so the year I came to Austin, I lived in 3 countries. I went from Singapore to Australia to Austin. I don't recommend that. It's a lot of change in 1 year. And then I've been in Austin now for 16 years. So the entire time that I was in college, I would actually spend my vacation time in Australia. My family had moved to the Gold Coast, which is about an hour outside of Brisbane. Beautiful, beautiful city. And then now they're back in Singapore. And so I mostly identify as Singaporean. But I also have a very international perspective of the world. My family took us traveling around the world every year. So I grew up visiting countries like Spain and Portugal and Japan and Thailand and the US and Canada, England. I say that my parents raised me and my little brother to be citizens of the world. So they wanted us to experience all kinds of cultures, to be able to appreciate the food and the people and to see history and things like that. Singapore, I feel like most people have heard of it now because of Crazy Rich Asians. I grew up with a bunch of Crazy Rich Asians. I grew up with, kind of a more affluent background. So what you see in the movie, if you saw it, it's not exactly complete exaggeration. So, I went to private school, I grew up with a lot of really amazing people. My parents have been married now for, almost 42 years. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, I had a very interesting experience. I consider myself bi-continental because I grew up mostly in Singapore, but then came here when I was 17 to start college at UT, and feel like I kind of grew up as well in Austin, just establishing myself in college, and then now working. So fun fact about me, my accent changes depending on who I'm talking to. So
Don't spend too much time with me then. You don't want to spend too much time with me.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Very cool. Very cool. And in growing up in Singapore, it was I've never been to Singapore, obviously, but how diverse is Singapore? Is it mostly people from different Asian countries? Is it mostly Singaporeans? Is it a mix?
Yeah, so Singapore is about 80% Chinese, ethnically Chinese. So I am Singaporean Chinese. My family is probably 4th generation Singaporean, but we can trace on both sides all the way back to China, like to the exact province in China. The rest of it is made up of Malay, Indian, and European. So we do consider ourselves a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. What is interesting about my experience is I have the unique perspective of actually growing up cultural majority. Like I tell people growing up in Singapore, I basically grew up the equivalent of a white person. And then I moved to the US where I'm now considered a minority. So I've actually got the experience of knowing what it's like to be the majority and the minority at the same time.
Yeah. Well, and I know just from things I've heard you say and work I've seen you done in the past, like carrying those two perspectives with a very mature realization of what those two perspectives have brought to your life, and being able to process through that. And I'm excited to have you on here because I know you're gonna help us. I know you're gonna help us tremendously today with your perspectives and your experiences. So thank you so much, Kim, for sharing a little bit of your story. So Bradley, how about you, man? Why don't you give us a little background? What was Youngstown like? What was life like growing up for you, your neighborhood, family, all that stuff?
All right. Well, thanks, Brett and Rosalind, for having me. Honored to be able to join you guys. Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So not as cool as Kim. Not bicontinental, but
I feel so unaccomplished after talking to
right.
Kim.
I'm like, dang, like
I've done
I
nothing
got,
in my life.
I got to do better. So I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, and was born there, and then we moved pretty quickly around to multiple states and cities, and then kind of ended up in Youngstown, Ohio, with my mom, single parent, and we were, if you know anything about Youngstown, it was probably one of the, well, it wasn't probably, it was the most violent city in America for at least a decade, or more. A lot of the it started with the mafia, and then it moved on to once the steel mills left, just utter depravity and just a dangerous place. I think we had the highest murder rate in the country for like 10 years in a row. So that's where I grew up. I grew up on the south side of Youngstown, Ohio. I was telling Rosalind the other day, on our street, the top half was where all the drug dealers were, and the trap houses, and all that. Am I echoing? I don't know.
No, you good?
Oh, yeah, and then on the bottom half, it was kind of safer. It was like the city park, waterfalls, all that cool stuff. So we lived on the bottom half, and you can literally walk up the street and hear gunshots and drug dealers, and go down to our street where there's 100-foot oak trees and all that kind of stuff. And so we kind of had a weird dichotomy growing up, growing up in church. We were kind of shielded from a lot of those things, but then having friends involved in certain things, and actually church kids having drugs in school, at church or at school, this church's school, selling it and all that kind of stuff was just the norm. So grew up there. Was blessed to get a scholarship at the University of Missouri, where was able to play and learn and meet Rosalind, and so forth and so on. Ended up matriculated on. So I don't want to take up too much time, but that's kind of the background.
And went on to play in the NFL and experience stuff, different
Yeah.
teams stuff. Well, that's important to know, because that's going to come back up in our conversation here as we asked about your perspective as far as institutions.
Yeah.
The NFL being one of the largest institutions in our nation, one of the most wealthiest institutions. So it's important people to know that you got that experience there as well. So, all right, well, Kim, let's come back to you. I want to ask you a question, but before I get there, I want to just make sure remind our class from week one, as we talked about the different meanings of some of the words that we're using within this class, like prejudice, bigotry, racism. Because I want to ask you a question, Kim, about your experience, your global experience, because you've lived in so many different places, have such a wide range of experiences with different cultures, as you said, as majority culture and as minority culture, living in Europe, living in Asia, living in Australia. So I want to ask you a question here, but before I do that, I just want to remind our people that when we talk about prejudice, what we're talking about is the prejudging of someone's life before you really know the facts about who they are. Generally, prejudice tends to be more of an unconscious or subconscious predisposition or predisposed belief that really results from the environment you grew up in, things that you were told as a kid, experiences you've had in your past. And so prejudice isn't necessarily a maliciously intended action towards somebody. It is a predisposition towards people of a certain skin color because of experiences or upbringing. When we talk about bigotry, that's really prejudice that has malintent. That's that someone, there is some hatred, there is anger, there is an intent to say, I'm going to believe this about that person because of their skin color. Whereas prejudice is, I believe this about that person because what I've been told, or what I was brought up believing about someone like that. And then racism is really bigotry and prejudice codified. It's that thing when it becomes institutionalized, when there are now systems and decisions and laws and people in authority making decisions that intentionally leave a certain people group out of the opportunity to oppress, to push down. So Kim, what I want to talk to you about is as an Asian in America, and I think that's important. You kind of corrected us as we were putting together your bio, and I thought you were Asian American, assuming that you were a citizen here of the U.S. You corrected me and said you're in the process of getting your green card, going through all that, which gives you even another layer of perspective of living in the United States of America. But as an Asian in America, as an Asian woman, and a person who's traveled all around the world in the way that you have, what are some of the prejudices and or racism that you see in America? And how do those prejudice or racism differ from what you have seen abroad in other parts of the world?
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, I think, as an international, one of the things that I think most people are very aware of, not being American, is there is a lot of tension between the white and Black community in America. That was basically my impression coming to the US. I think what is interesting about the US is I don't really think I've been in any other country where there really is such a melting pot of so many different cultures and ethnicities, and everyone has stereotypes of each other, right? Like I learned when I came to the US that apparently I'm automatically excellent at math, even though I was a communications major, but that I'm going to suck at driving, which is also interesting. So that was what I will say is that I think also that the US differs than other countries is because there's also a history of slavery, right? Like, so for example, in Singapore, we don't have a history of that. What is similar, I feel like, across the board from the different countries I've been to is there is racism and prejudice in just about every country I've been to. In Asia, there is a lot of colorism, right? Within Asian communities. And then also it just seems like anyone who is darker skinned, there is more racism and prejudice against it, right? So like here in the US, you guys talk about white privilege. In Singapore, they talk about Chinese privilege, we have a lot of Indians, Pakistanis, things like that. And I think what perpetuates that perception in Singapore particularly is in Singapore, it's very common to have domestic help, like domestic live-in help. They tend to come from countries like India, Pakistan, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. Like I grew up with Filipino, Indonesian maids or nannies living with us, so there's that. Australia was an interesting experience for me because they are actually very prejudiced and racist against Asians. There was a lot of feeling of tension. They're feeling like the Asians were taking the jobs away. I remember being 12 years old and there was a politician, I believe her name was Pauline Hanson. Her whole political campaign was get the Asians out of Australia. And I remember being there on a trip with my family, and a random guy driving by and literally yelling out the window, just cussing me and my family out, which is not a very pleasant experience, right? So what I will say is that I don't think that racism is necessarily an American thing, but it does vary from country to country depending on who the threat is perceived to be, right? But there is always going to be one or more groups that are singled out, and typically they're going to be the minority in whatever that country is.
Yeah, I think what little traveling I've done, when I was in Ethiopia, there was tribal prejudice between the different tribal groups. When I've been in Mexico, there's definitely the darker skinned Mexicans that tend to be more indigenous from Aztec and all that, the Aztec Empire and stuff, are definitely tend to be the more impoverished, the more discriminated. That's one of the things we talked about in the very first week of this class, was that the issue we're dealing with in our country right now, been dealing with in our country for a long time, but that's in the news and all around us right now is not primarily a black-white issue. It is a sin issue. It is it is the heart of man seeks to elevate ourselves above others so that to be like God rather than submitting to the one true God. So thanks for that perspective. What, as you were growing up in the different places that you've been, what was that shift like, going from being a place where you were majority culture and really probably experiencing some of that privilege you were talking about, to then being here in our nation in the United States and being minority culture and having some of those prejudices kind of pressed upon you? Just from a personal standpoint, help us understand like what that felt like to you and how you've processed through that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that my transition to the United States was probably significantly easier than most internationals. One being that English is my first language. Now, Singapore, we do have bilingual education. So I did grow up also, going to school and speaking Mandarin and learning Chinese and things like that. But we are an English speaking country, right? So immediately for me coming to the United States, I didn't have the barrier of one, having an accent, and two, not understanding people, right? Which a lot of the other internationals that I knew, they had that issue. Secondly, because I traveled so much and I've been to the US before, and because my parents themselves have lived in several different countries, they had a very global perspective. But I will say that where it got interesting for me, and this is where I talked to you guys briefly before this about what it means to be Asian in America versus Asian American. I actually had a really hard time connecting with the Asian American community when I first came to the US, especially when I was an international student at UT. What a lot of people don't realize, and I think this happens in other minority cultures as well, I'm considered what they would call Asian versus Asian America. And I didn't understand Asian Americans, truthfully, for the first 10 years that I was here. My experience coming to UT was, I was very excited. I wanted to meet everyone from all cultures, wanted to learn everything, try all the foods, things like that. I noticed a lot of the Asian Americans would kind of congregate together, but they didn't also fully understand their own culture or speak the language. And then there was also Asian Americans who would make fun of international Asians and call them FOBs, which stands for fresh off the boat, because of accent and things like that, which for me was very disconcerting because I get mistaken for Asian American all the time because I don't have an accent, right? And the other thing that I realized was my reaction to racism and prejudice was very different than my Asian American counterparts. And I think that is in large part due to the fact that I don't struggle with an identity issue. There are lots of Asian Americans, and now I'm actually pretty involved in the Asian American community, right? Like I've been working with them pretty closely for the past 3 to 4 years. A lot of them have stories of being bullied, of being discriminated against, of being made to feel like they were less worthy growing up, also growing up in a culture where they didn't see themselves represented very much in the media. I have a completely different experience, right? In Singapore, everywhere that I go, magazines, TV shows, radio, music, things like that, it's really Asian, but I also was consuming a lot of Western media, but I always saw myself reflected. So I feel like as an international who grew up cultural majority, whenever people have, if they've been mean or said something prejudiced or, whether intentionally malicious or not, my reaction usually, and most Singaporeans react like this, is, oh, you're just ignorant, because I don't have, I'm like, I'm proud to be Chinese, always been proud to be Chinese, always have been proud to be Singaporean. And I find that my Asian American friends don't have the same reaction. And it varies from region to region. I find that if they grew up in places like Houston or California, where there's like a large Asian population, they actually probably react a little more similar to me. But for those that grew up and maybe they were the only Asian family in their entire town, there's a lot of hurt there, right? So that's kind of been interesting for me because I expected coming to the United States that I was going to have to learn about a lot of different cultures. What I wasn't expecting was that I was also going to have to learn about Asian American culture. And what a lot of people also don't understand is that, Asian American isn't a monolith. You're talking about probably 35 different ethnicities rolled into one group, which doesn't work because we are different ethnically, we have different cultural backgrounds. And so even within the Asian American community, there is a lot of discussion and understanding that needs to happen there before we can even start talking about like the rest of the American community. So that has been something that's been super interesting, and that I've really enjoyed honestly learning about in my time here in the States.
Yeah. And I got my friend Sharif who's from Uzbekistan, and he's considered Asian American as well. And y'all's experiences are about as opposite as they could possibly be. So Kim, from in response to some of those things that you've seen, what kind of solutions to those prejudices and racist thoughts and the injustices that you've experienced yourself and that you've seen others experience, what kind of solutions do you tend to gravitate toward? Do you tend to go more towards there needs to be personal transformation or institutional reformation? And do you think there's anything lost if we only pursue one and not the other?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my preference would be for both. I think personally, I gravitate towards personal transformation for a couple of reasons, right? Like, I'm currently in the green card process. Like, my company is sponsoring my green card, which, with any luck, I will hopefully get it next year. Y'all can pray for that. So I can't vote, right? Like, I have no control over these what laws and policies that are happening in this country. Because I am international and currently on a work visa, I also have to be truthfully very careful, right, with getting involved with stuff like that, because the US, despite what a lot of people believe, is very hard to immigrate into. And there's a lot of things that you have to navigate in the legal process. And so while I do pay attention to what's going on, I personally don't have a lot of say in that right now. The other thing also is that in my experience with dealing with a lot of different people from different ethnicities and backgrounds, which is another thing that I've appreciated about just my career overall, I do think there's something about being international where people are way more open with their culture with you. I literally have been adopted into like Mexican, Indian, Nigerian, white families, like, and they bring me into their homes and foods, and they're very candid with their experiences. So I feel like I've actually been able to get a much better understanding because people are so open with me, because they're just like, oh, you're not American, so we'll really tell you what's going on, right? I find that my belief is that if you only change an institutional policy, but you don't take a look at people's heart and their own personal hurts, then I think eventually the same kind of stuff is going to perpetuate and rise up. And mostly because, when I was in ministry, a lot of what we did in college ministry, you're kind of involved in a lot of heart work, right? It's a lot of bringing healing to people. My friend Chris Wu and I, who's on here, we are involved in something called emotionally healthy spirituality, right? Which is Pete Scasero's work out of New York. And what I find is that whenever I've had conversations with people, racism is angry, right? But underneath the anger, there's usually fear. And underneath the fear, there's usually hurt. So if you don't address the root cause, which is oftentimes pain, then it's very hard for people to actually be able to see what is actually going on, because they're still grappling with their own hurt and their own pain. And so I have felt that for me, in what I can do, I would much rather spend a lot of time just trying to heal just one individual's pain, right? Because I think that there's a ripple effect that a healed person then doesn't react as strongly or get triggered as much. And then the way that they treat their family and their colleagues and their community changes. And I think eventually you get to institutional reform. Now, that doesn't mean that the people who can make institutional change shouldn't do that right now. But I think that you need both, right? Because if you only focus on yourself, then that's very inward focused, and you're not looking at how you can benefit other people who don't have a voice. But if you're only focused on political and institutional reform, then I think what's missed is the individual that just needs love sometimes. So
you're speaking my language. I love what you're saying. I'm gonna tell you what I find interesting about what you said is when people see you as an international, I think my assumption would be they realize, okay, she doesn't necessarily have a dog in the fight, so to speak. Like she's not representing a side here. So I can speak openly and candidly because I know she's not digging her heels in and kind of waiting to fire back at me. But you combine that with the heart of compassion that just says, I want to heal your pain. And what's crazy is like that's who we're called to be as followers of Christ, as people who aren't representing any cultural side of things, we're representing the kingdom side of things, internationals in a sense, even though we're citizens of the United States as Americans here. But I'm first and foremost a citizen of God's kingdom. And I ought to be seen in the same context of being an international way people see you, and that, okay, she's not just waiting to argue with me. She's not digging her heels in. I feel free to open myself up and talk to her about this because her perspective is not coming from an American sort of quote unquote perspective. It's coming from an outside perspective. I see the correlation there of really what it looks like for us to be citizens of God's kingdom. So thank you for sharing your story and those thoughts, Kim. Very, very helpful.
Yeah. One thing I will add to that is I do also think that the reason why people have been more open with me is there's something unique about being Asian and Christian in America, and that I'm not Black, I'm not white. Asians are kind of seen as somewhat neutral. We also straddle the line being considered minorities sometimes and not minority. There's a whole other thing in the Asian community where we feel like we're otherized by other minorities.
Yeah.
So that's a super interesting line to kind of straddle. And so, yeah, like when you put being Christian into it as well, and then also because I'm international and also can talk about the immigration process and things like that, I've just ended up being in this very unique position where I have my hands in multiple areas, not necessarily by choice, but just by virtue of that, it's opened up a lot of conversations with people.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, God has sovereignly placed you in a position where you can speak into things and people listen and hear. So the fact that you're speaking the word of God is encouraging. I love it. I love it. So, all right, Bradley, let's jump over to you, man. We're going to look more towards the institutional side of things, but can you speak on just some of the institutional racism, although, it's seemingly more covert, and it's really unique because, from my limited experience with the NFL, your much more extended experience in the NFL, majority of the people playing on the teams are African-American. And yet the majority of the ownership, I would say actually 100% of the ownership is white. And then the coaching and the people who are in positions of authority leans more white. Of course, there's more minority, more African-American coaches coming up, not nearly enough, but there's this weird dynamic in the people, the difference in the ones who the crowds come to watch versus the ones who have the money and the power. And so within that dynamic, would you just speak to the institutional racism that you see in the NFL, perhaps how it parallels with institutional racism that we see in other parts of our culture?
Great question. It's a lot to talk about. So I'm sure we won't get into all of it. Just to highlight a few things, I guess. I mean, the NFL is a microcosm of our society as a whole. If you look at it, there's some good things about it and some not so good things about it. The leadership, like you mentioned, is all white. And then you get to the actual workers, and they're mostly, 75-80% Black. Within those workers, you have certain groups that are amongst the team, generally are the leaders as players. So that's the quarterbacks. And then you have a lot of times the person protecting the quarterbacks are offensive linemen, and they're, for a large majority, they're white players as well. So, you start off with that, just how things play out, just as far as ownership, and then you go to the players and that dynamic, and then the coaches. Most head coaches are white. Most of the coordinators, offense, defense, special teams coordinators are white, but then position coaches, the guys who actually are working with those players every day to work on their skills, are generally African American guys who can relate to the players at a deeper level. So you have this structure, a system to where of control. And we would joke, it was even the white players, like, this is like, it felt, you're getting paid a lot of money, so don't get it twisted. But it felt like slavery in the sense that they literally have control over everything. Like you could go, you could go out for dinner at a restaurant and say in Philadelphia, and then you come back the next day and the security guy's like, "Hey, I was dinner at such and such," or I mean that just the access that these people have to literally control your life and to know everything that you've done is astounding. So it's just it's a microcosm. I think in a locker room, everybody's working towards the same goal, so that gives everybody that brings guys together in a different way than it does society as a whole. So that's special in that respect. But you still deal with some of the power struggle issues, and we can even dig deeper into the whole Black exceptionalism, and especially at the quarterback position. That's probably where I see the most institutional racism.
Yeah, well, fortunately, that seems to be changing in the right direction. When you got Lamar and I'm blanking on Arizona's quarterback,
Kyler Murray,
Kyler
Watson,
Watkins and Watson, and hopefully they're. I remember when Doug Williams won the Super Bowl back in the day. Right. Everybody made a big deal about it. Hey, a Black quarterback can win the Super Bowl. Wow, I was like, well, because he's a great quarterback, no matter what kind of skin is.
Exactly.
But yeah, I think and I think the fact that NFL players get paid so much, I think kind of blinds people to some of the institutional racism that does exist within that organization. Again, to your point, because people say, but man, you're getting paid millions of dollars or at least hundreds of thousands of dollars. So what are you complaining about? But the fact that you're getting paid doesn't take away from how you feel you've been treated. And I remember when I was up in Indianapolis with the Colts, they having some of those same thoughts of the way it's structured was like there's primarily it's white men with power and resources that are basically looking to pay folks who can make them money. And then so I noticed too, I was like, how come all the head coaches are white, but all the position coaches are Black? So, I remember having that thought back in the early 2000s of it's almost like the house slave, the one that keeps the other slaves in check, right? The one that gets them to go along with what the master wants them to do, kind of deal. It makes them feel better about it because someone that looks like them is telling them to do it. Exactly. Kind of deal. And I remember I actually had a conversation about that with my position coach at University of Georgia, who was a Black man, one of my dearest friends, loved the guy to death. His name's Leon Perry. And I remember us having that conversation and him saying he felt like that was what was expected of him, was to keep, because of course as a running back, I'm the only white dude in the whole room. And so he felt like, man, my job is to keep these young Black men in check and keeping them in line so that they can continue to make the university money. And it was a tough scenario and situation for him to be in. So if you could, well, let me just ask you this, man, because obviously there is some change that's taking place, especially with a lot of the racial conversations happening now, and the protests, what the NBA players did during the playoffs. It brought a lot of conversations to the surface about changes that need to be made, even in these institutions where athletes are making millions of dollars, but being treated certain ways and viewed certain ways. And there are some changes taking place within the NFL, but why do you think institutional reformation, institutional change is so difficult to accomplish?
I mean, like we always say, it goes back to the sin issue of always wanting to elevate ourselves above someone else, to have that power control, to be the one in charge. And I think, to go back on the previous topic of the NFL, especially the quarterback position, I think you mentioned Lamar Jackson and Deshaun Watson and Kyler Murray. Like it's okay if you're the first pick in the NFL draft, or you're this dynamic talent, you're this dynamic personality. Like, these people want to win games. These organizations, like, so if it doesn't matter if you're Black or white, but if you're exceptional, like, then you could lead our team for sure, because you're going to help us win, and that's going to help us make more money, so forth and so on. But the exceptionalism part, everybody's not exceptional. There's when you see change as far as the backup quarterbacks, it's okay to be an average Black quarterback, or it's okay to be on the back end of a roster as a Black quarterback who never plays, who holds a clipboard for 10 years. Then I'll say, okay, we've made progress. But it's even now that we have these more Black starting quarterbacks than we ever have, it's like they have to be exceptional in order to be considered a leader of a team. And even then, you know, if a guy struggles, you know, if a Lamar Jackson struggles, um, and they have more issue with him because, you know, he's not the typical quarterback that you would expect to see leading the team or representing the organization, because he has braids or dreadlocks, or he wears jewelry, or he drives a what's considered a flashy car. Then he's considered, you know, something else other than what a quarterback should be. So I think, you know, why it's so hard is because we've been taught and indoctrinated on what things should be, how they look like, how the structures work. Our expectations, as you know, in our workplaces or in our schools, on how things are taught, our expectations have been set for so long of what things should be. You know, even for Christopher Columbus, like, hey, he sailed the ocean blue in 1492, he discovered America. But then you come back, you dig deeper into it, it's way more than that. It's you know, a lot of untruths in that. So I think just the indoctrination is it's a hard thing to break down, and it's painful for a lot of people, and but it's liberating for most people. So I think just that the fear of unraveling everything that you built your life on is tough to face.
Yeah, yeah, and I think also the point you made of if this is what keeps me in power and authority and comfort and, you know, prestige and all those things that come with it, then making changes to that is also risky and fearful, because what it may cause me to lose the power and privilege and prestige that I've been experiencing.
Right.
I mean, I experienced a little bit of that as you and I, from opposite sides of you being a quarterback, me being a running back. Because that perception about running backs is kind of the opposite of what it is as quarterbacks. If you're white, you can't be a good running back. Yeah. Therefore, we're not going to give you a chance, because you're not going to help us win. You're not going to make us money. Crowds aren't going to come watch you. You know, that kind of deal. Fortunately, Christian McCaffrey is helping prove. It's like, man, if I had just come along a decade later.
But it's like that's exceptionalism with Christian, like, because he's just exceptional talent and he's accepted. But you can't just be an average, you know, guy that plays special teams. A white run was just like, it just doesn't happen.
You get cut.
You get cut. It's like, oh no, but this guy, you know, he's whatever. And as that, with you being a white running back, as a black quarterback, my intelligence being questioned, literally at every turn. Like, coaches tell me, hey, you're smart enough, right? Or you can handle this information, right? And then once you prove to them over and over again that you can, then it becomes, okay, now you're in this room with all these other white quarterbacks, and if we say certain things, and now you're connected with the other members of the team who are majority black, and we can't say those same things.
Right.
We can't communicate the same way. We can't, I mean, the conversations that go on as far as people's personal lives and what they can handle. And I mean, people just being called flat out idiots and dumb, but like, it's mind boggling. And once you stand up for something and say, hey, why are you talking about my teammate like that? They're like, nah, you can't be a part of this group.
Yeah. You get excluded at that point. Yeah.
Right.
That was one of the things that helped me tremendously when I was at Georgia, was being in a room of all black men as a running back and hearing their conversations, hearing their perceptions and their experiences. So they didn't hold anything back. Like, they're just, you're talking about how it is. And I'm like, dang, that's what y'all experienced. That's what y'all, man. And so it really opened my eyes to a lot of those experiences and some of the prejudice and racism that was going on. So last question for you, Bradley and Kim. I want you to chime in on this one as well. This will be our last question here. You know, I know, Brad, in conversation we've had, I've heard you talk about being in conversation with people, and this is just culturally, I've heard this said as well, that racism is a mental illness or a psychological problem. And I've always responded to that by going, man, that feels like an easy way out. That feels like a cop out, because that means I can treat someone from a place of prejudice, bigotry, or racism, and then still consider myself the victim of, well, you know, I just have a mental illness, or it's a psychological issue, or whatever. Our culture tends to like to put us in places where we don't have to take personal responsibility for anything that we say or do. And so my approach would be more of, man, racism seems to be more of a soul issue, more of a heart issue, more of a sin issue. And so if each one of you could just briefly speak into that, of your perspective on that, and then what do you think is easier to solve? A mental psychological issue or a soul heart issue?
Kim, you can go first.
Kim, you go ahead.
Okay. Here's the thing, right? Are there situations where racism happens because it is an intersection with a mental illness? Absolutely. Right. I have had very personal experiences with individuals close to me that struggle with mental illnesses, and that in and of itself is hard.
Yeah.
But to say that it is only a mental illness, I vehemently disagree with, because I do think that as Christians, we understand that humans are inherently sinful.
Yeah.
And racism to me is kind of tied in more to ego, right? Because I do feel that most people, given the choice, if you have a situation where you can benefit yourself and you can feel superior to other people and things like that, without Christ in the picture, I have a hard time finding people who wouldn't take that option. Right. And so I do think that at the end of the day, it is a heart issue. Now, is some of it taught because of the environment you grew up with? Absolutely, right. So I think there's a lot of people that don't even realize sometimes that the beliefs that they have or the perceptions that they have are actually prejudiced and racist and things like that. Like I myself have had that, right? Because I grew up cultural majority. Yeah. You know, there we can even talk about, just as an international, there's a perception that most Americans are dumb, right, and ignorant, and it's a thing, you know. And so even as an international, there's the whole sometimes sense of like, well, you know, you feel superior because we know more about what actually the rest of the world looks like than a lot of Americans who have never literally stepped outside of their own country. I think that for me, when I think of racism and I think of prejudice, I think about it from a standpoint of, do you look at other people and look to see how different you are so that you can feel better about yourself and better than them? Or when you meet individuals, do you actually look and see that this is somebody that God has created and therefore they have inherent value? Now, it doesn't mean you have to like everyone. It doesn't mean that you have to be friends with everyone. Yeah. But it does mean that to the best of your ability, you should respect and honor them the best way that you can, right? And every interaction is going to look a little different, right? But that's kind of the posture that I think, if we were to take that kind of posture, I think that would remove more, you know, some of the, oh, well, they look different than me because I've had a past experience that was really bad with somebody else that looked like them. You know, stop making assumptions, right? Because here I think is the difference between majority and minority culture. Majority culture has the privilege of individuality, right? We are treated as individuals, right? Minority culture does not. I went from being an individual in Singapore to coming to this country where all of a sudden sometimes I'm like the spokesperson for the Asian community, right? Which is very strange. And I myself usually have to go like, ooh, like I can't speak for the entire Asian community because I am a part of, you know, multiple ethnicities rolled into this group. But that is the burden I think that a lot of minorities carry, and it's because of a lot of perceptions and misunderstandings and stereotypes that have been placed on people. And I think that sometimes the reason why people do it is, yeah, lack of accountability. It's just easier, right? Because if you have to look at somebody every single time and consider that this is a person with their own story, their own experiences, their own hurts, their own successes, it's a lot of mental work, right? And the reality is, we don't want to do the work all the time. It's easier just to look at somebody and go, oh, well, you're probably going to be like this because statistically, blah, 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 right? But I think that if we say that we truly want to love other people and we truly want to value them, then part of it is saying no to our own ego and going, but they're worth it because they are valued, right? So if somebody has a mental illness and it compounds things and it's hard, yes, have grace, have forgiveness. But for the vast majority of people, I tend to look at them and go, you know better, right? Because because I think the question that we'll always ask for most people is that if, especially majority culture, is that if I can ask you, would you actually want to be a minority in whatever country? And their immediate response, honestly, is no, then I'm like, then you know already inherently that something is not right about racism and prejudice. And if you can recognize that it's not right, then therefore you also have the mental capacity to treat people better.
Yeah. Amen to that. Well said. Well said. Bradley, what do you think?
I mean, you and Kim, like, I don't need to add anything to like. What's that?
So that was kind of a mic drop.
Oh yeah, it's like nothing else needs to be said. I mean, I think well, I guess since I have to say something, just I mean, to call it a mental illness is like, I think it's disrespectful to actual mental illnesses. Like, it's like people who are actually struggling with those things, and like that's, so that's a cop out for sure. Like I don't have any space for that. But as Kim said, you can compound it, with, if you already have an existing mental issue, then that you can compound it for sure. I mean, it's more so racism as a disease that you get to choose if you want it or not, and you can spread it or you can stop the spread. So I look at more as a disease that that can be controlled and can be stopped if you recognize, number one, that it is sickening, it is wrong, it is something that you are benefiting from, and also that I can stop it. I can help to get rid of it from my family by, giving a vaccine of love and empathy and the gospel and education and all those things. But if but at the same time, I can bring more of that disease into my house, but would I teach my kids, would I show my family who we talk to, who our friends are? So it's a disease that it's the number one disease in America that can be controlled and can be cured, but it takes a conscious decision to do it.
Yeah, man, that was so poetic too. Thank you for sharing that. That was awesome. Yeah, I love it. I think it's a sin that can be repented of, just like any other sin. It's a sin of preference, and James tells us very clearly: you show preference towards one person because you think that benefits you, then you're not displaying the love of Christ. So, Kimberly, Bradley, thank you so much for